For decades, the abortion debate has generated massive amounts of formal logic, yet almost no one ever changes their mind. We usually attribute this deadlock to ignorance, religious dogma, or bad faith. We assume the other side remains unconvinced because they simply fail to understand the argument. But the actual breakdown happens much earlier. It happens upstream of logic, before the argument even begins. The opposing sides operate with different ontological grammars, the hidden machinery manufacturing the moral objects we argue about. This grammar supplies subjects, assigns properties, and sets defaults. Later, logic merely sorts what grammar already stamped out. This grammar represents the inherited framework through which the world becomes discussable. To figure out why the debate is stuck, we have to reverse engineer the nouns and verbs of the dispute itself, inventorying the assumptions they carry by default. As long as we mistake these pre-logical setups for objective reality, our arguments will remain trapped in an endless loop of speaking past one another. Take the foundational claim of the debate: human life has value. The answer feels so obvious that it arrives before the question even finishes. But watch how the sentence structure itself performs the substantive moral work. The grammar treats human life as a bounded container and value as a property permanently stored inside it, independent of capacity, relationships, or circumstances. Outside of this specific debate, our institutions do not operate this way. They rely on indexed value. Hospitals rank patients by survivability in triage. Regulators accept predictable fatalities when setting speed limits. Courts and insurers assign specific monetary values to injury and statistical life. Society constantly weighs, compares, and trades human value against other goods. The abortion dispute reintroduces an absolute, undifferentiated version of value, as though ordinary institutional practice had never happened. By grammatically locking value inside the organism, any proposed termination appears first as the destruction of an absolute property, rather than a conflict among bodies, interests, and possible futures. We see another grammatical trick in arguments about potentiality, specifically the claim that an embryo will become a person. This timeline shows how future tense smuggles in numerical identity. We treat the organism and future adult as the same subject, traveling smoothly through labels. What early embryos can divide, they can fuse. Mosaicism means cells can have different genetic makeups. Biological development isn't a stable object acquiring new properties, like a house getting a coat of paint. The relevant unit of identity is something we construct based on the purposes for which we individuate it. When we use the phrase "the same human being," we compress massive philosophical questions into one subject. We assume biological continuity equals personal identity, and that a future person's standing extends backward to every early developmental stage. Treating developmental continuity as a discovered fact rather than a grammatical convenience forces a rigid boundary onto a fluid biological process. The dispute also relies on the language of possession. We say an embryo has standing, has rights, or has interests. This diagram shows relational standing. The embryo's status depends on surrounding institutions. It may be mourned as a child by a family, litigated as property in a courtroom, or donated for research. The entity remains unchanged, but its legal and moral treatment varies with intention. Standing behaves less like an inner substance and more like a relationship among an entity, other people, and social practices. It is conferred, it's negotiated, or withdrawn. We use this grammatical shorthand elsewhere. We say a corporation has rights, or a dead person has wishes. These are useful formulations, but usefulness should not be mistaken for ontology. The grammar of possession makes a complex social negotiation look like a simple object awaiting detection. Then there is the unstated asymmetry at the core of the debate. We treat continuation as the default state, and cessation as something requiring justification. This framing assigns the continuing process to nature. It happens, while assigning the interruption to agency. It is done. A pregnancy doesn't continue without material demands. It occupies a body, alters it, exposes it to risk, and reorganizes a person's future. Describing continuation as the absence of intervention is only possible if you treat these physical costs as background rather than imposed burdens. A society can decide that existing developmental processes deserve presumptive protection, But that presumption must appear as a political choice, not as nature's untouched baseline. By hiding the costs of bodily conscription behind the grammar of defaults, the debate automatically places the burden of proof on the side of interruption, asking what justifies ending the pregnancy, rather than what justifies requiring its continuation. The word abortion promises a singular object and invites a singular verdict, for or against, right or wrong. But the term fuses three distinct legal and moral questions into one biological event. The red ring represents the first question, bodily conscription. May one person be compelled to sustain another organism within their body? Imagine a thought experiment where humans reproduce by laying fertilized eggs. Once the egg is laid, the issue of bodily autonomy ends. The conflict changes. You can separate the question of bodily occupation from developmental standing, what is actually owed to the developing organism inside the shell. It also isolates the third question, transfer. A person might reject parenthood, but could relinquish gestational and custodial obligations to another person or institution without destroying the organism. This thought experiment doesn't solve the moral problem. It reveals that our familiar problem is not one problem. Our legal frameworks buckle because we demand a single categorical boundary, a line defining personhood, viability, and autonomy all at once, and ask it to do jobs it cannot bear. Our logical arguments fail to connect because they are offered to different subjects existing inside different manufactured worlds. Acknowledging that meaning and value are constructed does not make them trivial. Money is a manufactured concept too, and it governs our reality. Manufactured values direct human lives and institutional consequences. Exposing the grammatical mechanisms of this debate does not automatically settle abortion in either direction. It doesn't erase vulnerability, attachment, or suffering. But conceptual exposure is always preferable to inherited obscurity. Only by recognizing our ontological grammar as a human invention can we step upstream and make our moral frameworks honestly available for revision.